I am Dennis Keating, Emeritus Professor, Urban Studies at Cleveland State University in the United States. My topic is the politics of rent control in the United States. Over the last few years, the policy of rent control, or it's sometimes called rent stabilization, has made a comeback in parts of the United States due to rising housing costs and tenant organizing in response to that in the face of a huge shortage of affordable housing. I will explain the politics surrounding these conflicts between advocates and opponents, focusing on the states of California, Illinois, Massachusetts, Minnesota, New York, Oregon, and the state of Washington. In the first workshop, I explained the history of rent control in the United States, and very briefly, it began just after World War I in Washington, D.C. and New York City. It was revived during World War II as an emergency measure. After 1950, for a couple of decades, it survived only in the state of New York, and most notably the city of New York, which has had rent control and rent stabilization, two different systems, since 1950. It revived again in the late 60s and early 70s in the states of Massachusetts and California, and also in our capital, Washington, D.C. And now, in the last several years, due to the affordable housing crisis in the United States, it has once again seen a comeback. I'm going to talk about the opposing views and experiences of tenant organizations, mostly volunteers, opposed by landlord organizations and the real estate industry, which is heavily financed and has exercised great lobbying influence in state legislatures as well as nationally. Nationally, we do not have rent control in the United States. And in fact, the real estate lobby was able to, through a Supreme Court decision last year, end the eviction moratorium during the COVID crisis in the United States as an example of their influence at the national level. I'm going to talk about the difference between politics at the state level. We have 50 states in the United States, as opposed to the local level. When rent control was adopted by cities like San Francisco and Los Angeles in the late 70s, the real estate industry in California, our largest state, went to the state legislature to try to block that. Failing that, they then put on the ballot in the 1980 election a preemption initiative, which would have, in effect, restricted local controls as opposed to an outright ban. The tenant organizations in California, aided by localities that supported them, was able to defeat this initiative in a upset, being heavily outspent by the real estate industry. However, the real estate industry then went to the legislature later, and in 1994 succeeded in passing legislation that preempted local rent control laws, and in particular inserted a provision called vacancy decontrol. This allowed landlords in California to raise rents by as much as 20% over their regulated rents every time a tenant vacated the apartment. It restricted any further adoption of rent controls by local governments, and it later also was accompanied by a different law in California, which allows landlords to declare that they're going out of business, and in most cases will then turn their rental properties into condominiums for sale or other uses to avoid rent control. The attempts in 2018 and 2020 by statewide initiative supported by tenant forces failed to repeal these preemptive measures passed previously by the California legislature. And in both cases, those initiatives and their supporters were heavily outspent by the real estate industry. With that success, landlord organizations, and in particular the National Association of Realtors and the National Multifamily Housing Council, went across the country influencing state legislatures to either ban outright any local rent controls or to severely limit them. They convinced 37 of the 50 states to do exactly that, so that over 2/3 of the United States does not have rent control or the possibility of rent control due to those preemption bans or restrictions. Now, recently there have been attempts to overcome those, in particular in the state of Illinois, which the governor supports, but a repeal of the preemption ban in Illinois would not be supported by the mayor of Chicago, and tenants in Chicago, one of our largest cities, are the ones that have tried to unsuccessfully so far convince the legislature to repeal that preemption. Likewise, in the state of Washington, tenant activists in Seattle and other parts of the state have unsuccessfully tried to convince their legislature to repeal their ban on local rent control. We do have one interesting success, and that was reported on previously by my colleague Ed Getz, and that is in 2021, the cities of St. Paul, the capital of Minnesota, and Minneapolis were both able to, in the case of St. Paul, enact a very strict rent control law. In the case of Minneapolis, allow for the local government, which it has not done yet, but may in the future adopt local rent control. That is the only success so far in overturning previous preemptive acts by state legislatures. However, we did see a new phenomenon in 2019. The state of Oregon was the first in the United States to adopt not rent control, but a ban on rents above a level, in the case of Oregon, dictated by the legislature, 10% a year, so that there is a upper ceiling on allowable rent increases. That was followed by California in 2019, which adopted a similar ceiling on allowable rent increases across the state of California, regardless of whether there was local rent control or not. However, their ceiling was 5% plus a allowance for inflation, which right now is raging in the United States. So we have varied experiences in the United States. I will finally talk about New York in detail a bit later. What we have in the United States in terms of politics are heavily well-financed real estate organizations, usually in political debates in public, putting forth not their organizations, but rather so-called small landlords. These are mom and pop landlords who perhaps own a few units, and they are often the face of the opposition to rent control or rent stabilization, even though in most laws in the United States that we have regulating rents, they are exempted, either because they own only a few units or because they are owner occupants of at least one of the units in their building. So nevertheless, they present a more favorable face to the opposition to rent control. The real estate organizations and landlord organizations also have been aligned with most economists in the United States who, when polled or asked or have written about rent control, almost, not quite, unanimously condemn it as a regressive housing policy. However, of late, progressive organizations nationally have attempted to counter those views and to put forth the positives that accrue with rent regulation. In terms of the campaigning for rent control, as Professor Getz has already explained, at the local level, the odds are that the real estate interests will heavily outspend the proponents of rent control, who usually have to gather signatures to put it on a ballot for the public to vote on it, since most legislative bodies, with a few exceptions, have not done that, and mobilize tenants so that in major U.S. cities where tenants are a majority of the population, not only Minneapolis, but also San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York, Washington, D.C., the tenants will far outnumber, obviously, landlords or those who support them. Homeowners, as a third party, are often divided on the question of rent control. So, generally speaking, we have had mixed results. I'm going to talk a bit about New York. previously the other major victory of landlords, and they are often able to do much better at the state level, despite that 1980 example in California, was in 1994 when landlords in Massachusetts sponsored a statewide referendum to repeal local rent control authorized by the state, and were successful very narrowly in winning that referendum and therefore ending rent control in 3 cities, Boston, and a couple of its neighboring suburbs. Attempts to repeal that referendum and reinstate the possibility of local rent control in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts have failed so far. So our major example, and a very complicated one, is New York City. In the state of New York, New York State authorizes rent control and has since 1950 based upon an emergency. And even now, with decades of rent regulation in place in New York City, rents in non-regulated apartments are rapidly rising in the city of New York, one of the most expensive housing markets in the United States. Very briefly, New York City had rent control until the year 1969, with apartments being vacated by tenants and rent control gradually fading out. However, in 1969, due to a crisis in rising rents in newer buildings, a new law was passed, noted as rent stabilization. It applied to larger buildings built before 1969. Unlike rent control, which more strictly regulated allowable rent increases, it established an appointed board. That board, appointed by the mayor of New York, meets annually to determine what rents will be allowed. In its early years, it was largely a system of self-regulation by landlords, with lots of problems from the tenant point of view. Then in 1971, the landlord lobby went to the state capitol in Albany, convinced the New York State legislature to also pass vacancy decontrol, just like California did later. That allowed landlords to raise rents every time a tenant vacated an apartment before that apartment became once again subject to rent stabilization. Tenants for decades fought to repeal vacancy decontrol without success. Then in 1991, the state legislature, again at the behest of the landlord lobby, passed another exemption called luxury decontrol, in which high rents were decontrolled when they reached a certain level. And as a result of vacancy decontrol from 1971 and luxury decontrol from 1991, hundreds of thousands of units in the city of New York were deregulated. As we speak here in 2022, most rent-controlled units are few and far between. However, about 1 million apartments in New York City, occupied by about 2 million tenants, are still subject to rent stabilization. And in 2021, after decades of fighting the landlord lobby, with the Democratic Party gaining control of the New York State legislature and being attuned much more to the needs of tenants, tenants succeeded in passing a comprehensive reform of rent stabilization, ending its temporary nature, making it a permanent policy, also eliminating those 2 vacancy policies that led to so much decontrol of apartments in New York City. So where do things stand in the United States? Landlord organizations and the real estate lobby continue to oppose whenever attempts are made to expand rent control or to strengthen rent stabilization where it exists. Tenant organizations, as they have in the states of Oregon and California, have continued to make small gains in terms of rent caps, as they did in 2019. And unfortunately, of those many, many states where bans and restrictions on local rent controls were passed in decades past, they remain in effect, with the sole exception so far of the example of Minnesota and the cities of St. Paul and Minneapolis. So to conclude, in the United States, the politics of rent control are heavily influenced by money and spending. The opposition to rent stabilization or rent control policies by the real estate industry, generally speaking, at the state level, have succeeded in overwhelming tenant attempts to either maintain rent control at the local level or to expand it. But at the local level, where tenants have mobilized, where tenant organizations exist that are strong, despite being heavily outspent or being subject to the lobbying efforts of real estate organizations in legislative bodies, they have been able to succeed, as the example of New York says, although it often takes a very long time for them to overcome those political obstacles. And that is the state of politics in the United States of rent control. Thank you very much.